She was standing in a field of wildflowers, wearing a wedding dress that didn't belong to this decade. That was the first thing Silas Boone saw when he crested the ridge that morning. A woman alone in the middle of the Texas prairie, pale blue fabric catching the wind, not moving, not crying, just standing there like she was waiting for something that was never going to come. He almost turned his horse around. Almost. But then he heard her father's voice echoing in his head from the night before. "Don't go near the north field in spring. That's all I'll say about it." And Silas Boone had never been good at leaving things alone. If you've ever loved someone you couldn't keep, if you've ever worn your grief like a second skin because putting it down felt like betraying the dead, then this story is going to reach inside your chest and not let go. Before we begin, if you're new here, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from right now? I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Silver Mesa, Texas. Spring, 1887, and a woman standing alone in a field, wearing the most beautiful and most heartbreaking dress you've ever seen. The morning Silas Boone rode onto the Mercer Ranch for the first time, he had exactly 43 cents in his front pocket, a name that meant nothing in this county, and a bedroll that had seen more skies than ceilings. He wasn't looking for trouble. He wasn't looking for much of anything, if he was being honest with himself. He'd answered the ad tacked to the post outside the feed store in Caldwell because the words were plain and the work sounded hard, and hard work was the only thing that reliably quieted the noise in his head. Experienced ranch hand needed. Silver Mesa. Fair wages. No charity cases. That last line had almost made him smile. Thomas Mercer had met him at the gate, a wide-shouldered man in his early 60s with a face like cracked leather and eyes that measured everything twice before deciding anything once. He'd shaken Silas's hand without looking away, which Silas respected, and asked him 2 questions. First, could he work from sunup past sundown without complaint? Second, had he ever been fired for something that mattered? Silas had said yes to the first and no to the second. Thomas had studied him a beat longer than comfortable, then jerked his chin toward the bunkhouse and told him to be at the fence line by 5 in the morning. That was it. No welcome. No warmth. But no cruelty either, and Silas had learned the hard way that absence of cruelty was more valuable than most men understood. He'd eaten supper alone that first night, listening to the sounds of the household through the thin walls, dishes being set down, a chair scraping across a wood floor, low voices he couldn't quite make out. He'd heard a woman's voice once, clear enough to catch the edge of something tired in it. Not the tired of a long day. The other kind. The kind that lives in a person for years. He hadn't thought much more about it. He'd slept, woke at 4:30, and been at the fence line before the sky had fully decided what color it wanted to be. It was 9 days into his time at the Mercer Ranch before Thomas stopped watching him quite so hard. It was 12 days before the other 2 hands, Court, who was 40 and built like a fence post, and young Danny, who was maybe 19 and still optimistic about things, started acknowledging him as something more than temporary furniture. Silas didn't push for any of it. He'd found over years of moving from ranch to ranch across 3 states that trust was like fence wire. You couldn't rush it, and if you pulled too hard before it was set, it snapped. He kept his head down. He worked until his shoulders ached, and his hands bled at the knuckles, and his boots were permanently caked in the particular red clay of the Silver Mesa bottomland. He did what he was told. He didn't ask questions that weren't his to ask, which is exactly why on the 14th morning, when Thomas Mercer pulled him aside before breakfast and said, low and serious, like a man giving a warning he hoped he'd never have to explain further, "The North Field, in spring. You don't go there, understood?" Silas had simply nodded and said, "Understood." He had meant it. He genuinely, completely meant it. And then, 3 days later, a calf got loose and pushed through the split rail on the east fence and went exactly where calves went when given the chance, which was nowhere sensible, and Silas had spent the better part of 2 hours tracking the stupid animal across scrub brush and rocky ground until he found himself at the edge of a wide, sloping meadow he hadn't seen before. The calf was standing in the middle of it, placid and unbothered, as if it had personally arranged to be there. And 20 yards beyond the calf, near a cluster of bluebonnets thick enough to look like a patch of fallen sky, stood a woman in a pale blue dress. Silas pulled his horse up short. She didn't hear him. The wind was coming from the south and carrying the sound of hoofbeats away from her, and he wasn't sure how to put it, even in his own head, elsewhere. Not daydreaming, not sleeping on her feet. Somewhere more deliberate than that. Like she had traveled to a specific place inside herself and was standing in it with intention. The dress was the thing that stopped him from calling out right away. It wasn't work clothing, wasn't anything close to the practical cotton and canvas he'd seen her in every other morning, because he'd figured out by now that the tired-voiced woman was Adeline Mercer, Thomas's daughter, the one who ran the household and kept the accounts and never seemed to stop moving from one necessary task to the next. This dress was something different, long and pale, with a fitted bodice and small fabric-covered buttons along the back that someone had sewn with careful, patient hands. Delicate in a way that felt out of place against the raw Texas landscape. And yet it looked exactly right on her. That was the thought that embarrassed him slightly, so he pushed it aside and focused on the practical problem of the calf, which had now wandered another 10 feet closer to the woman and was eyeing the wildflowers with intent. He dismounted quietly, caught the calf by the rope he'd looped around its neck 2 miles back. The animal protested with a sound that was loud enough that Adeline Mercer turned, and for one unguarded second before she'd had time to rearrange her expression into something appropriate, he saw her face the way it actually was. She'd been crying, or she had cried sometime in the last little while. Her eyes were dry now, but had that particular brightness that came after, like something had been scoured clean and was still raw from it. She wasn't 25, wasn't a girl. But there was something in her face in that instant, before the composure settled back into place, that was so unmistakably young in its grief that it caught him somewhere under his ribs. She said, "You're not supposed to be here." Her voice was flat. Not rude exactly. More like someone stating a fact they wish were different. "I know," he said. Calf got loose. She looked at the calf looked at her. Silas held the rope and tried to figure out where exactly to point his eyes. "The north field," she said. "My father told you." He did. And yet, he agreed. There was a silence that should have been uncomfortable and somehow wasn't quite, though he couldn't have explained why. She looked back out toward the field. Her hands were at her sides. She didn't fidget. He noticed that, the stillness of her, the way she seemed to take up exactly the space she meant to take up, and not a fraction more. "That's a beautiful dress," he said. He hadn't planned on saying it. It came out the way true things sometimes did, sideways, without warning. She didn't look at him right away, just kept her eyes on the middle distance, and something shifted in her jaw. A tightening. Like the words had landed somewhere specific and she was deciding how to carry them. "It was made for my wedding," she said. The past tense of it told him everything. He didn't say "I'm sorry" because sorry was what people said when they didn't know what else to do. And it didn't seem like she needed that from him. He didn't say anything at all, just stood there with the calf and let the silence be what it was. And then, quietly, so quietly, he almost thought he'd imagined it, she said, "To a man who didn't survive long enough to see it." He could have left it there, could have taken the calf and gone back the way he came and given her the privacy she hadn't asked for but clearly needed. That would have been the sensible thing, the respectful thing even. But something about the way she said it, not fishing for comfort, not performing grief, just stating it the way you stated a fence line or a property boundary. Something about that made him stay where he was and say, "How long ago?" She looked at him then, really looked, like she was deciding whether to be offended. 8 years, she said, "and you come out here every spring." It wasn't a question, she heard that. "Every spring," she said. "Why, wearing the dress." Wearing the dress. He nodded slowly. He could feel her waiting for the judgment to arrive. The gentle kind. The well-meaning kind. The "you should really be past this by now" kind that people delivered wrapped in sympathy, so the recipient couldn't complain about it. He'd received that kind himself, from people who loved him, and it had made him want to walk into the next county. Instead, he said, "My brother died on a Tuesday morning in October. I still can't make myself work a full day on a Tuesday in October. I just..." "Slow down. Can't explain it better than that." She stared at him. He scratched the back of his neck, mildly embarrassed. Sorry, I wasn't trying to make it about me. How long ago? She said, using his own question back at him, and something in her voice was different. Something had shifted, just slightly. 6 years. Another silence. This one different in texture from the first. You don't look like a man who slows down for anything, she said. And it wasn't flattery. She was just observing. I'm better at hiding it than I used to be, he said honestly. Doesn't mean it's gone. She turned back to the field. He thought maybe she was done talking, which would have been fair. He was a stranger, and he'd already said more personal things in the last 3 minutes than he typically said in a month. But after a moment she spoke again, and her voice had lost that flat, careful quality. Not entirely, but some of it. His name was Robert, she said, my fiancé. He was 26, and he was crossing the river on the way back from Caldwell, and the water was up from the rains, and he... She stopped. Started again. They found him 3 miles downstream, 2 days later. I'm sorry, Silas said, and this time the words came from somewhere real, not just reflex. I've had 8 years to be used to it, she said. I'm still not used to it. People keep telling me 6 years is enough time to be used to things, he said. I figure those are people who haven't tested the theory personally. And then, unexpectedly, quietly, with what seemed like mild surprise at herself, she almost smiled. Not fully, just a flicker of something that pulled at the corner of her mouth and then released. But it was real, whatever it was, and it felt like something he hadn't earned and wasn't sure he deserved, and he was aware of it in a way that was disproportionate to how small it was. Your brother, she said. What was his name? Caleb, he said. What happened to him? And here was the part where Silas usually deflected, usually said it's a long story or doesn't matter now, or some other perfectly serviceable lie that kept things on the surface where they were safer. 8 years, 6 years of practice had made him smooth at it. But she'd just told him about a man she'd worn her wedding dress in an empty field to mourn, so the least he could do was give her something honest. Horse fell on him during a cattle drive, he said, out in New Mexico. I was 50 yards behind him, and I couldn't get there fast enough. She looked at him. I was supposed to be riding beside him, he said. I'd fallen back because I wanted to roll a cigarette, and I didn't want him giving me grief about it, because he always gave me grief about smoking. And then he stopped. The rest of it was familiar enough that he could say it without his voice doing anything that would embarrass him. He was gone before I got to him. That's not your fault, she said. I know that, he said. Some days I even believe it. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him with an expression he couldn't read. Not pity, not the gentle condescension of someone who felt sorry for you. Something more level than that, like she was seeing him the way he actually was, and had decided that was all right. I used to think, she said slowly, that if I came out here enough times, if I kept the dress, if I just held on hard enough to what it meant, I could keep them both. My mother made this dress. Did you know that? She died 2 years after Robert did, and every time I put this on, it's... She pressed her lips together. It's both of them. He didn't say anything. He thought about all the things a person could say to that and came up with none that were better than silence. My father thinks I should have sold it by now, she said. Given it away, something. He doesn't understand why I keep it. Does he need to? Silas said. She looked at him sharply, not angry, just caught off guard. I mean that respectfully, he said. Grief's not something that follows the same schedule for everybody. Your father's a man who probably buries his in work and forward motion. That's his way. Yours is different. That doesn't make yours wrong. It's been 8 years, she said, quoting someone, he suspected. Maybe her father, maybe her own harder voice. My brother's been gone 6, and I still haven't eaten chicken on a Tuesday in October because it's what we had for supper the night before he died, Silas said. I know how long it's been. Knowing how long it's been doesn't do much for you. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but almost. Adeline Mercer, she said, and put out her hand. Silas Boone, he said, and shook it. Her grip was firm, working person's grip. He'd already known that about her somehow, known that whatever softness was in her came from choice rather than circumstance. "You're going to get fired," she said, "when my father finds out you were out here." "Probably," he agreed. She looked at him for one more moment, something unreadable moving across her face. Then she bent down, without any ceremony, picked up her skirts, and started walking back toward the ranch house. She didn't say goodbye. He got the feeling she wasn't someone who wasted words on the conventional exits. He stood in the wildflower field with the calf for a long while after she was gone, the wind working through the bluebonnets, the sun getting higher. He thought about Caleb, about Tuesdays in October, about the way some things took up residence in a person and simply refused to leave, not because the person was weak, but because the things that had been lost were genuinely worth missing. He looked back at the spot where she'd been standing. Then he turned, led the calf back toward the east fence, and got to work. Thomas Mercer was waiting for him at the gate. Silas stopped. Thomas looked at him with those measuring eyes, then down at the calf, then back at Silas. "Found it in the north field," Silas said plainly, because he'd decided years ago that lying cost more than it saved. Thomas's jaw tightened. Not rage, something colder and more controlled than rage. The anger of a man who had learned to keep things locked down because the alternative was worse. "You saw her," Thomas said. "I did." "And?" Silas met his gaze. "And nothing. She's grieving. It's not my business." Thomas was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved between them. Somewhere in the upper pasture, a horse called out and got no answer. "She's been doing this for 8 years, Thomas said, and the gruffness in his voice had something underneath it, something worn thin and ragged, the sound of a man who'd watched his daughter carry a weight he couldn't take from her and had spent years furious at his own helplessness. "Every spring, same dress, same field." "I know." "It's not. She's not crazy," Thomas said, and the defensiveness in it told Silas that someone somewhere had implied otherwise, and Thomas had never forgiven them for it. "Of course she's not," Silas said. Thomas looked at him. Something in his posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Not warmth, not yet, not from a man like Thomas Mercer who gave nothing away cheaply, but a fractional lessening of something that had been braced. "You'll stay on," Thomas said finally, "but you'll respect what's hers." "That's all I intend to do," Silas said. Thomas took the calf's rope from him and walked toward the pen without another word. Silas watched him go. He stood there in the dust and the morning light, and something he couldn't name exactly. Not hope, too big a word, too forward-looking. Something more like attention had been quietly turned in a new direction. He didn't examine it, not then. He just went back to work. The days that followed Silas's accidental trespass into the north field passed the way most days on a working ranch passed, loud with physical labor, short on sentiment, and structured enough that a person didn't have too much time to think about the things they'd rather not think about, which suited Silas just fine. He didn't mention the encounter to Court or Danny, didn't bring it up at supper, didn't let it show on his face when Adeline came out to the bunkhouse porch to leave the weekly wage envelopes, didn't do anything with the memory of it except fold it carefully and set it somewhere out of the way you'd handle something breakable that didn't belong to you. She didn't mention it either. He hadn't expected her to. What he noticed over the following week was that she'd stopped looking through him. Before the field, she'd had the practiced non-seeing of a woman who managed a household of men and had developed careful professional blindness as a survival strategy. After the field, she looked at him when she spoke to him. Not warmly, not yet, but directly, like he'd been reclassified from background furniture into something that occupied actual space. It wasn't much. He told himself it wasn't much. He kept working. The fence line on the south property needed nearly 200 yards of new wire, and Thomas had assigned him to it alone, which Silas understood was either a punishment or a test or both. He went at it without complaint, out there in the heat with the wire stretchers and the digger, and the particular misery of post-hole work in clay that had dried to near concrete in the weeks without rain. His hands blistered and the blisters broke, and he wrapped them in strips of old cloth and kept going. Court came out on the third day and watched him work for about 10 minutes without saying anything, Then, "You don't quit, do you?" "Not on offense," Silas said. "Not on much, I figure," Court said, and rode off. Which was high praise from Court, who communicated primarily in single syllables and extended silences. It was Danny who told him the story. The way young men always told you the things you hadn't asked to know, casually, incidentally, like he was just filling in background noise. They were mending tack in the barn on a Thursday evening, the light going gold outside, when Danny said, without looking up from the harness he was stitching, "You know about Mr. Mercer's daughter? About her and the fella that drowned?" Silas kept his eyes on his own work. "Heard a little." "Robert Halley," Danny said, the way young people use names like they were keys that unlock tragedies. "This was before I came on, but Court knew him, said he was a good man, good with horses, real easygoing type." He paused. "River took him in April of '79. He was 26. "That's what I heard," Silas said. "Miss Adeline was 22, Danny said. She'd been engaged to him near a year. Her mother sewed the wedding dress herself. Took her months, Court said. Then Robert drowned 3 weeks before the wedding, and her mother, well, she got sick not long after. Some people said it was grief made her sick. I don't know about that, but she was gone inside 2 years. Silas set down the piece of leather he was holding. "Danny." "Yeah? You ever think that some things aren't yours to tell?" Danny blinked, opened his mouth, closed it, had the grace to look uncomfortable. "I just thought, since you were new—" "I know what you thought," Silas said without heat. "And I'm not angry, just leave her privacy. Whatever she's been through, she's not a story to explain to new arrivals." Danny nodded, slowly, and went back to his stitching with the chastened look of someone who'd meant well and knew it hadn't mattered. Silas picked his leather back up, but the details had settled into him whether he wanted them or not. 22. A mother who'd sewn a dress for a wedding that never came, and then died from something that might have been grief or might have been coincidence, but was certainly both in Adeline Mercer's mind. 22 years old and handed that much loss inside of 2 years. And then 8 more years of managing a ranch and keeping accounts and making sure everyone was fed and the wages were right and the fences didn't fall down, all while carrying the kind of weight that bent most people crooked. She wasn't bent, he thought, not crooked. She was compressed, like something that had been pressed very hard and held its shape by refusing to give anywhere. He wasn't sure that was better. The following Monday morning, she came out to find him at the water trough before breakfast. Came out on purpose, he could tell, because she had the look of someone who'd made a decision and was getting on with it before they could unmake it. "You were kind the other day," she said. "In the field. I wanted to say thank you." He turned from the trough. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I wanted to." "All right." She studied him for a moment. Her hair was pinned back, but the morning wind was already pulling pieces loose, and she didn't bother with them. "My father isn't angry with you. I want you to know that. He told me he spoke to you." "He did." "And you didn't get defensive about it." "Wasn't anything to get defensive about. I went where he asked me not to go. He had the right to say something." Something in her expression shifted, so subtle he might have missed it if he'd been looking somewhere else. Something that might have been relief or recognition, or the small surprise of encountering behavior that matched her expectation of decency for once. "He's a man who says things once," she said. "If you hear him, you're fine. If you don't, you're gone." "I heard him," Silas said. "Good." She turned to go, then stopped. Didn't quite turn back. Spoke to the middle distance instead. "His name was Caleb, you said. Your brother." "That's right." "Was he older or younger?" "Older? By 4 years." A pause. She seemed to be weighing something. "I have a younger brother," she said. "Jesse. He's 23. He's—" She stopped. Chose different words. "He's not careful enough about things." "Most 23-year-olds aren't," Silas said. "No," she agreed quietly. And then she went inside. He stood by the water trough and tried to figure out why a 40-second conversation about nothing in particular felt like it had covered a lot of ground. He went to work. Jesse Mercer showed up for the first time that afternoon, riding in from Caldwell on a horse he'd clearly pushed harder than necessary, with the particular loose-limbed energy of a young man who had never met a speed limit he respected. He was lean and dark-eyed like his sister, with his father's jaw and something in his grin that was entirely his own. The grin of someone who found most situations funnier than they probably were. He dropped off his horse at the rail and looked Silas up and down with frank, uncalculating curiosity. "You're the new hand." "Silas Boone." "Jesse Mercer." His handshake was hard and quick. "You staying?" "Long as your father needs me." Jesse grinned. "That's a diplomatic answer. The last two hands gave up on the South Fence project after 3 days." He squinted at Silas's wrapped hands. "Looks like you didn't." "It's just a fence," Silas said. Court said the same thing. "Court's been here 9 years." Jesse tilted his head slightly. "You're either actually tough, or you're stubborn enough that the difference doesn't show." "Little of both, probably," Silas said. Jesse laughed, a real laugh, unperformed, and clapped him on the shoulder with the ease of someone who'd never been told not to, and went to find his father. Silas watched him go and understood immediately what Adeline had meant by not careful enough. It wasn't recklessness exactly. It was more that Jesse Mercer operated at a volume that the world could be sharp and dangerous, and seemed not to have fully absorbed the information. He was the kind of young man who'd cross a river in spring without checking the water level first, because he'd crossed rivers before. And the law of prior success is a seductive and unreliable teacher. The thought arrived with a chill Silas didn't pursue. The dynamic of the ranch reorganized itself slightly around Jesse's presence. Thomas became less economical with words, not more so. His son pulled something out of him, some looseness that manifested in longer sentences and the occasional rough-edged joke. Adeline moved through the household with the specific vigilance of an older sister who loved her brother completely and trusted his judgment approximately 30% of the time. She never said anything critical about Jesse in front of others. She didn't need to. The way she watched him cross a yard or mount a horse said enough. It was over the supper table on Jesse's third evening. Silas didn't eat at the main house, but Adeline had started bringing coffee to the bunkhouse porch after supper on some evenings, which he'd come to understand was the Mercer household's version of an open invitation, that Jesse said across the yard and loud enough to carry, "Adeline says you lost your brother." Silas looked up from his coffee. Jesse was leaning on the porch rail of the main house 20 feet away, arms crossed, not unkind, just direct in the way young men were direct when they hadn't learned yet to be circuitous. "She said that?" Silas said. Jesse shrugged. "She said you understood something she said about grief, and Adeline doesn't say that about people." "So, did you?" "I did," Silas said. Jesse was quiet for a moment, then, "Robert was my friend. Before he was my sister's fiancé, he was my friend. I was 15 when he died." He said it plainly, the way people said things they'd said to themselves many times and arrived at a form that didn't bleed anymore. People forgot about that part. They focused on what Adeline lost, and my mother, and rightly so. But I lost a friend. "That matters too," Silas said. Jesse looked at him. "Most people say something about how at least I was young enough to get over it." "Most people say stupid things about grief," Silas said. Jesse was quiet another moment. Then he uncrossed his arms. "You want a drink? I've got whiskey." "I could use a drink," Silas said. They sat on the bunkhouse porch for 2 hours, and Silas learned that Jesse was studying law by correspondence, teaching himself from books he ordered from a printer in Austin, and wanted to practice in Caldwell someday, and that Thomas thought this was impractical and possibly vain, and that Adeline thought it was exactly right for him and had been quietly helping him pay for the books out of household funds for 2 years. He learned that Jesse knew about his sister's annual visits to the North Field and had never said a word about it to anyone outside the family, not because he'd been told not to, but because he understood without being told. He learned that Jesse was brave in the instinctive, uncalculating way that was less a virtue than a temperament, the kind of person who ran toward trouble because the thought of standing back simply didn't occur to him quickly enough. It was the kind of bravery that got people killed. Silas knew it because he'd had it once himself. He kept that thought to himself. What he couldn't keep to himself as April deepened into May was that he was thinking about Adeline Mercer more than was entirely sensible. Not in a way he'd acted on, not in a way he intended to act on, but in the particular way that thoughts sometimes developed a gravitational pull, regardless of what you intended, the way a person's voice started taking up more room in your head than it had been given, the way you noticed when she was in a room and noticed more pointedly when she wasn't. He'd catch himself watching her cross the yard and think something like, "She's tired today. She was up before 4," because he'd started being attentive to the details of her in a way he hadn't been attentive to much of anything in years. That part worried him, honestly. He hadn't put roots anywhere since Caleb died. He told himself it was practical. Ranch work was seasonal. Circumstances changed. A man without attachments could move freely. And that had been true enough to be convincing for 6 years. But sitting in the cooling evenings of Silver Mesa with coffee going cold in his hands and the sound of the Mercer household settling into night, he was beginning to suspect that practical had been a prettier word for something else. Running. That was the less pretty word. He'd been running the same direction for 6 years, which was away from the moment the horse had fallen and he hadn't been close enough to help, away from the weight of Caleb's death and the specific agony of his own guilt about the cigarette and the 50 yards and the irreversible cascade of small choices that had put him in the wrong place at the worst possible second. Ranch to ranch, state to state, keeping everything light enough to leave on short notice. He was thinking about this on a Thursday in mid-May when Adeline came to find him at the south fence, which was finished now, and handed him a second cup of coffee without comment. She had her own, and she sat on the top rail the way she'd clearly been sitting on fence rails her whole life. Easy, balanced, her boots hooked on the lower wire. They didn't always talk when this happened. Sometimes they just sat. Today she said, "My father asked me last night if I thought you were staying." Silas looked out at the pasture. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know." A pause. "Were you planning to?" He considered lying, considered the easier shape of sure, long as the work holds up, the non-committal answer that left all the doors open. Then he considered who he was talking to, a woman who had stood in a field for 8 years in a wedding dress and told a stranger about it in the first 60 seconds of meeting him, because she'd recognized that he wasn't going to perform sympathy at her. She didn't need his easy answers. "I don't know," he said. "Honestly." "That's more honest than most people are," she said. "You asked an honest question." She turned her coffee cup in both hands. "Where do you go when you leave places?" "Wherever there's work." "That's not an answer." "I know." She looked at him sideways, not pushing, just waiting, with the patience of someone who had learned that most things revealed themselves eventually if you gave them enough room. "I go where I don't know anybody," he said finally. "Where nobody knows me. It's—" He stopped. Started again. "It's easier to be nobody somewhere new than to be Caleb Boone's surviving brother in a town where everybody knew him." She was quiet for a moment. "There's a name for what you're doing," she said. "I know because I spent about 3 years doing the same thing, except I couldn't leave, so I just got very busy, found things to manage. If I was managing something, there was no space to just feel the thing." "Did it work?" "For a while," she said. "Until it didn't." "What happened when it stopped working?" She looked at the pasture. "I found the dress again. I'd put it in the cedar chest and told myself I was done with it. And then one spring morning I couldn't sleep and I went down to the chest and I just sat on the floor next to it for a long time. And I thought, I can pretend the thing in this chest doesn't exist, or I can carry it honestly, and only one of those is actually surviving." She exhaled. "That's when the spring visit started." Silas thought about that. "Some people would say going out there every spring is avoidance," he said, not arguing, testing to see what she'd say. "Some people would be wrong," she said simply. "Avoidance is pretending it isn't there. Going out there is the opposite of avoidance. It's the only hour of the year I'm completely honest about it." He turned that over in his head. He thought about Tuesdays in October, about how he'd tried in the years after Caleb to push through them, to work harder, stay busy, not slow down, and how that had worked about as well as Adeline's 3 years of managing. "I've been thinking," he said carefully, "that I've been doing this wrong." "Running?" she said. He glanced at her. She hadn't been there for his internal monologue, obviously, but she'd clearly arrived at the same word from a different direction. Running, he confirmed. The problem with running, she said, is you're very good at it. You don't even look tired. I am, though, he said, and it came out quieter than he meant it to, more exposed than he was comfortable with. He looked away, out at the pasture. She didn't comment on it, didn't move toward it or away from it, just sat with it, the way she sat with most things, directly, without flinching, without pushing. Thomas Mercer's voice came from the direction of the barn, calling for Court about something to do with a water trough, and the ordinary world reasserted itself around them. Adeline finished her coffee, climbed down from the fence rail, and smoothed her skirt with the automatic gesture of someone who didn't think about it. She said, "For what it's worth, I think this ranch could use someone who doesn't leave." She walked back toward the house. He stood at the fence for a long moment, her words settling into him the way significant things sometimes did. Not with fanfare, just with weight, finding the places where they belonged and sitting down in them. He picked up his tools and went back to work. Thomas found him an hour later, stood beside him without preamble, watching the pasture with his hands behind his back, doing the thing he did where he said nothing long enough that most people got uncomfortable and started filling the silence with things they hadn't meant to say. Silas had learned not to fill it. Finally, Thomas said, "My daughter is not a woman who warms to people quickly." "I've noticed," Silas said. "She's not cold," Thomas said, which was the most offensive sentence Silas had heard the man produce, and therefore told him a great deal. She's careful," Silas said. Thomas cut a look at him. "Yes." "That's not a flaw," Silas said. Another long silence. A hawk circled somewhere above the near tree line, riding a thermal in patient circles. "I buried a wife," Thomas said. "I watched my daughter carry a loss that should have been split between two families and ended up entirely hers. I'm not—" He stopped. His jaw worked for a moment, the internal machinery of a man who expressed almost nothing trying to process something he needed to say. "I'm not going to watch her hand herself over to somebody who's going to leave." "That's fair," Silas said. Thomas looked at him sharply. He'd probably expected argument. Most men would have given argument. "It's fair," Silas said again. "You're her father. She's been through enough. You're right to say it." Thomas was quiet for a long time. "I'm not saying anything about you in particular," Thomas said finally, carefully. "I'm saying it in general." "I understand." "Do you?" Silas met his gaze. "I've been thinking about whether I'm somebody who stays," he said. "I don't have an answer yet. When I do, you'll be the first person I tell." It was more honesty than Thomas had probably wanted, delivered more plainly than he'd probably been prepared for, from a man who didn't owe him that transparency and had offered it anyway. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. Something in his expression that Silas couldn't name exactly. Something that might have been respect, might have been pain, might have been both sharing the same face because they'd lived together long enough to blur. "All right," Thomas said. He turned and walked back toward the barn. Silas exhaled. The month of May finished itself in heat and hard work, and the gradual, unremarked deepening of something that had no name yet, and that all the people involved were carefully pretending to not be paying attention to. Adeline began leaving his coffee slightly stronger than the other men's. He noticed. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. It was information, and they both filed it. Jesse started including him in conversations at a volume that suggested he'd been assigned the role of family ambassador without being told about it, which Silas suspected Adeline had not authorized, and Thomas had decided to not specifically prohibit. Jesse had a gift for normalizing things by simply behaving as though they were already normal, and Silas found it disarming in a way he couldn't counter effectively. Court said one afternoon at the trough, without any preamble, "You ride better than you let on." "I don't let on anything," Silas said. "Exactly," Court said, and walked away, which Silas spent an unreasonable amount of time interpreting. And in the evenings, sometimes, when the work was done and the light was going amber and the day had burned itself down to something quieter, Adeline would come to the porch with 2 cups, and they would sit in the cooling air and talk about things that mattered and things that didn't. And Silas would catch himself thinking, with the particular alarm of a man recognizing something he'd lost the ability to prevent. He was not running anymore. He wasn't sure when he'd stopped. He couldn't locate the exact moment, but somewhere in the clay-red dust of Silver Mesa, in the slow accumulation of fence posts and coffee cups and conversations on rail fences, the running had quietly ceased. He sat with that for a long time, not sure if it was the bravest thing he'd done in 6 years or the most dangerous. Maybe, he was starting to think, those were the same thing. The first week of June arrived with a sky that couldn't make up its mind. That was how Thomas Mercer described it later, in the flat, factual way he described most things. The sky couldn't make up its mind. 3 days of heat that pressed down on the valley like a hand on the back of your neck, then an afternoon of strange green light and a wind that came from the wrong direction, then heat again, then clouds that built and built on the western horizon and sat there like a threat that hadn't decided to follow through yet. Silas noticed the clouds. He'd spent enough years moving through different territories to develop a working respect for weather that announced itself slowly. Fast storms you could prepare for. The slow-building kind. The kind that gathered its resources over days and waited for the right moment. Those were the ones that caught people. He mentioned it to Thomas on a Wednesday morning, standing at the barn door and looking west. Thomas looked where he was looking. "River's already up from the snowmelt," Thomas said. "It gets much more on top of that." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They moved the cattle from the lower pasture that afternoon. All of them. Silas, Court, Danny, Jesse, even Thomas himself, which told Silas how seriously the man was taking the sky. It was hard, sweaty work, cattle being cattle about being moved from grass they'd decided was theirs. And they didn't finish until the light was nearly gone and everyone's horses were tired and irritable, and Silas's right shoulder had developed the deep ache that came from too many hours with the rope. Jesse was in high spirits about it, which was Jesse's response to most physical difficulty. He came back from the far end of the pasture with 2 stragglers and a grin and said, "That's all of them. I counted twice." And Thomas gave him a single nod that, from Thomas Mercer, constituted enthusiasm. At supper, the kind of end-of-hard-day supper where nobody talked much because the talking required energy nobody had left, Adeline set plates down and refilled coffee, and at some point caught Silas's eye across the table with a look that said simply, "You're watching the weather." He gave a small nod. She gave a small nod back. Thomas saw it, said nothing, but his jaw moved slightly in the way it did when he was processing information he hadn't asked for and wasn't sure what to do with yet. The storm didn't come that night, or the next. It came on Friday morning, just before dawn, and it didn't come gently. Silas was already awake when it started. He'd been lying in the bunk listening to the wind pick up for the past hour, the way it does when something serious is on its way, shifting direction twice and then settling into a steady push from the northwest that rattled the bunkhouse roof and drove dust under the door. He was dressed and had his boots on when the first real rain hit, and he was at the barn within 2 minutes of that, because the horses needed calming before they worked themselves into panic, and panicked horses in a barn during a serious storm were a problem that compounded quickly. Court was already there. Of course Court was there. 9 years on this ranch, and the man had developed a weather sense that bordered on uncanny. They worked in silence, checking stall latches, moving feed, calming the mare that always went first when the atmosphere changed. Outside, the rain went from hard to harder in the space of about 20 minutes, and then the sound changed, deepened. And Silas stepped to the barn door and looked out and said quietly, "That's a lot of water." Court came to stand beside him. They watched the rain come down in sheets that the lantern light caught sideways. The yard was already sheeting. "River," Court said. "Yeah," Silas said. Thomas appeared out of the dark in the rain, hat pulled low, moving fast for a man his age. He got to the barn and stood in the door for a moment, breathing hard, looking at the yard. "It's up," he said. "Went up fast overnight. I can hear it from the house." "How far's the nearest crossing from the lower pasture?" Silas asked. "Quarter mile," Thomas said. "But we moved the cattle yesterday." "I know. I'm thinking about the fence line on the south bank. If the water comes over it, it'll push the fence into the Delacroix property," Thomas said. He already knew. He'd been thinking the same thing. I'll deal with Delacroix later. That's a fence problem, not today's problem. What's today's problem? Court said. Thomas didn't answer right away. He looked out at the rain with the expression of a man doing arithmetic that wasn't adding up to anything good. Jesse, he said finally. He rode out before 4. Wanted to check the creek on the north boundary before the storm hit. The silence that followed had weight to it. Silas said, "Which direction does the north boundary creek drain to?" Thomas looked at him. "Does it drain to the river?" Silas said. "In high water," Thomas said, slowly, like he was hoping the words were wrong as he was saying them. "In high water, the creek backs up from the river, and the low area between the creek and the northern fence floods out." "How bad?" "Bad enough," Thomas said. "In a storm like this? I've seen it go—" He stopped, made a sound that was almost nothing. "It can go fast." Silas was already moving for his horse. "Boone," Thomas said. He stopped, turned. Thomas was looking at him with an expression that was doing too many things at once, fear and pride, and a father's specific, helpless fury at situations beyond his control, all fighting for space on a face that was designed to show almost nothing. "He's a good rider," Thomas said, like he needed to say it, like saying it made it more true. "I know he is," Silas said. "I'll find him." He took the roan, not the best horse on the ranch, but sure-footed in mud, which mattered more right now than speed. He rode north with the rain driving sideways into his right side, the kind of rain that found every gap in your coat inside the first minute and soaked through to your skin within 5. The yard disappeared behind him. The track turned to mud that sucked at the horse's hooves and pulled with each step. He kept moving. He heard the river before he saw it. That was the thing about rivers and flood. The sound changed completely. The Sandoval River under normal conditions made a sound like moving water was supposed to make, a sound a person could talk over. In flood, it made a sound like something being destroyed slowly and continuously, a low roar with texture to it, the sound of mass and force and absolute indifference. Silas had heard it before, years ago, in a different state, and the sound had never left him. He crested the low rise above the north boundary and pulled up hard. The river had come up at least 8 feet, maybe more. It had spread out of its banks and taken the low ground on both sides, and the area between the creek and the northern fence, the area Thomas had described, was no longer land. It was a moving sheet of brown water 3 feet deep and maybe 40 yards across, broken by fence posts and scrub brush that stuck up through the current at irregular intervals. Jesse's horse was standing on the near bank, reins trailing, eyes white-rimmed and blowing hard. No Jesse. Silas's heart did something specific and unpleasant in his chest. He scanned the water fast, the way you scanned for something you desperately needed to find, and were terrified of finding at the same time. The current was moving south, fast, carrying debris, broken branches, a section of fence rail, something that had been a hat. Then he heard it, a voice cutting through the roar, not words, just sound, the particular sound of someone using everything they had left to make noise. He found Jesse 30 yards downstream, clinging to a fence post that was still anchored in the ground, the water running chest-high past him, pulling at him with the patient, enormous strength of moving water. He had one arm hooked around the post and the other arm out for balance, and his face was turned upstream, mouth open, and when he saw Silas on the bank, he yelled something that the roar swallowed completely. Silas was already uncoiling his rope. He didn't think about the river. He'd learned, in the years since Caleb, that there was a kind of thinking that helped in a crisis and a kind that didn't, and the kind that didn't was the kind that ran the full inventory of everything that could go wrong. So he didn't think about the current or the debris in it, or the fact that if his horse went down, they were both finished. He thought about the rope and the angle and the distance, and whether the fence post Jesse was holding would last another 60 seconds. He swung the loop twice. The rain made it heavy, sluggish, and through. It fell short. He hauled it back. The roan shifted under him, nervous, and he steadied it with his knees and his voice, low and continuous, the same tone he'd have used to talk it through anything. Swung again, through. This time the loop landed over Jesse's shoulder, and the young man grabbed it with the arm that wasn't hooked around the post, grabbed it with both hands, and the rope went taut. "Let go of the post," Silas shouted. Jesse's face, even from 30 yards across the roar, through the rain, showed everything. The specific terror of releasing the only thing between you and the current. The calculation, if you could call it that happened in the half second before a person chose to trust something other than what they were already holding. Jesse let go. The current took him immediately, swung him downstream on the rope, and Silas felt the pull of it through his hands and through the horse, and he held. He held, and the roan held, and the rope held, and Jesse swung in an arc through the brown water and crashed into the bank 10 feet downstream, and Silas was off the horse and sliding down the bank before Jesse had stopped moving. He got his hands under Jesse's arms and pulled, the mud of the bank giving under his boots, his bad shoulder screaming, and they came up out of the water together in a tangle of rope and soaked clothing and came down on solid ground, both of them breathing like they'd been running flat out for a mile. Jesse lay on his back in the mud and stared at the sky and said nothing for 10 seconds. Then, "I couldn't get across. The creek. The water came up so fast, I couldn't." "I know," Silas said. He was on one knee, still holding the rope in one hand, catching his breath. His hands were shaking. He noticed that with a distant, clinical interest. "Don't talk yet." "Is my horse—" "Your horse is fine. Don't talk." Jesse put his arm over his face. His chest was heaving. When he moved his arm, his eyes were wet, and it wasn't from the rain. "I thought—" He stopped. "When I saw you on the bank, I thought—" "I know what you thought," Silas said. He put his hand on Jesse's shoulder, briefly, the kind of contact men offered each other when words weren't the right tool. "You're all right." Jesse looked at him. Really looked the way a person looks when they've just been very close to something final, and the world has snapped back into focus. And everything in it looks different for a few minutes, sharper, more particular, more valued. "You went in after me," Jesse said. "I threw a rope." "You went in after me," Jesse said again, like the correction didn't apply. "You didn't—" He swallowed. "You didn't stop and think about it." "I thought about the rope," Silas said. "That's all I had time for." They rode back in the rain, Jesse on Silas's roan because his own horse had finally moved off somewhere and would have to be collected later, and Silas walking alongside holding the rein because the horse wasn't going to carry double in mud this deep without making bad decisions. The rain was easing slightly, the worst of it moved east now, but the air was still cold and wet and the sky was the color of an old bruise. They came into the yard to find Thomas standing at the gate. He'd come out without a coat. He was standing in the rain in his shirt and his hat, and he was very still in the way Thomas Mercer was still when he was managing something that otherwise would have managed him. He looked at Jesse on the horse, and at Silas beside it, and at the mud and the rope still looped over Silas's shoulder, and he didn't say anything. Jesse climbed down from the horse and said, "I'm all right, Pa." Thomas put both hands on his son's face. It was the gesture of a man who had fought himself for control his entire adult life and had just lost, briefly, and didn't care. He held Jesse's face in his hands and looked at him for a long moment, and then he pulled him in, one hard, brief embrace, the kind that communicated everything and asked for nothing, and then he released him and stepped back, and his face had reassembled itself into something closer to Thomas Mercer again, though the seams showed. He looked at Silas. Silas waited. "Go get dry," Thomas said. His voice was rough. "Both of you." Jesse went. Thomas didn't move. He stood looking at Silas with an expression that Silas had never seen on him, or rather, had never seen him allow. It was open in a way Thomas Mercer's face almost never was. It was the face of a man who'd been handed something he hadn't asked for and couldn't figure out how to account for. "The rope was—" Silas started. "Don't," Thomas said, quietly. "Don't explain it down to nothing." Silas stopped. "You could have called for me first," Thomas said. "Could have ridden back, could have waited to see if the water dropped." "He didn't have that kind of time," Silas said. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once, the way he always nodded, but with something behind it now, something heavier and more permanent. He turned and followed his son inside. Silas stood in the yard in the rain, his shoulder on fire, his hand still not entirely steady. the rope hanging from his hand and dripping mud into the yard. He stood there for a moment longer than made practical sense. Then he went to the barn to deal with the horses. He didn't hear the door open. He was at the water barrel, cleaning up as much as the cold water would allow, when he heard a step on the barn floor behind him and turned. Adeline was standing in the barn doorway. She was in her house dress with a shawl pulled around her shoulders and her hair half down from whatever it had been in that morning. She looked like someone who had been very, very afraid and had just been given the reason to stop, and the transition between those two states was still happening visibly on her face. She hadn't finished becoming calm yet. She probably wouldn't be for a while. She looked at him. He waited. "Jesse told me," she said. "He shouldn't have made a story of it," Silas said. "It was a rope. The horse did most of the work." "Stop that," she said. And the sharpness in it surprised him. Not anger. Something more urgent than anger. "Stop making it smaller than it was." "I'm not—" "You could have died," she said. "If the rope had snapped. If your horse had gone down. If Jesse had been 10 feet farther out." Her voice fractured. She pressed her lips together. When she spoke again, it was quieter but no less precise. "You went in there for my brother." "He's your family," Silas said. Like that explained everything. To him, it did. She looked at him for a long moment with an expression that was doing too many things for him to read cleanly. Gratitude, yes, but underneath it something else, something that was almost frightened, that had the specific quality of a person who had just discovered something they hadn't prepared themselves for. "I couldn't see you from the house," she said. "I heard Father go out and I went to the window and I could see him at the gate, but I couldn't. You and Jesse were out of sight, and I just—" She stopped. "I stood at that window for 20 minutes. He said nothing. "I have stood at that window before," she said. "A long time ago, waiting for news of a different kind. I stood there and I told myself it was different, that I wasn't—" She stopped again. "And then Jesse came into the yard on your horse and I counted. I counted until I saw you come through the gate behind him, and I—" She cut herself off, looked away. Her jaw was tight. Silas set down the cloth he'd been using and turned to face her fully. He said, carefully, "Adeline." She looked at him. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. Not as a promise about the ranch or the work or the practical arrangements. She heard that. He saw it in her face, the way the words landed and where they landed, the way something in her went very still. "You don't know that," she said, but her voice had lost its edge. "I know I'm standing here," he said. "Right now, that's what I know." She looked at him for a long time. The rain was letting up outside, the sound softening, and the barn smelled of wet hay and horse and damp earth, and neither of them moved for a moment that stretched long enough to matter. "I'm not—" she started, then stopped, reorganized. "I am not a woman who does things impulsively. I think about things. I take a long time." "I know that about you," he said. "I just want you to know that what I'm—" She stopped again, breathed. "I don't say things I don't mean." "I know that too." Her hands were clasped in front of her, tight, the knuckles pale. She looked at them, then back at him. "I was frightened for you," she said. "Not the way you're frightened for someone you've hired or someone you work beside. I was frightened for you the way I haven't been frightened for anyone in a very long time, and I didn't choose to feel that way, and I don't entirely know what to do with it." The honesty of it cost her something. He could see that. She was a person who measured everything before she gave it out, and she'd just given him something unmeasured, and her whole posture had the slight tension of someone waiting to see if that had been a mistake. He said, "I know." "That's all you're going to say," she said, and something in it was almost a laugh, just for a second. "I'm taking a minute," he said, "because you said you don't do things impulsively. I'm trying to match that." She looked at him. The almost laugh was still there at the corner of her mouth, and beside it something softer and much less guarded than she usually allowed. "Fair enough," she said. She left the barn. He listened to her footsteps cross the muddy yard, and then the sound of the house door closing, and then nothing but the rain coming down to its final few drops and the horses settling back into their usual evening conversation of small sounds. He sat down on a feed crate and looked at his hands. They'd stopped shaking. His shoulder was going to be bad tomorrow. He'd need to wrap it before the morning work started, or it would seize up and be useless by noon. He thought about what she'd said. The way I haven't been frightened for anyone in a very long time. He thought about standing at the bank of that river with the rope in his hands and the 40 yards of brown water between him and Jesse, and not stopping to think about it, just moving, just doing the thing, because it was the only option that made any sense. And he understood, sitting in the barn in the quiet after the storm, that he hadn't just been acting on instinct when he'd done that. He'd been acting on something that had taken up residence over the past 2 months without announcing itself. The specific, uncomplicated conviction that Jesse Mercer's life was worth more than whatever risk it cost to preserve it, because Jesse was Adeline's family, and Adeline had somehow become, without his permission, without his planning, without his conscious participation, someone whose grief he was no longer willing to be part of. He wasn't sure that was a comfortable thing to realize. He also wasn't sure it mattered whether it was comfortable. Thomas came to the barn an hour later. Silas was still there, finishing with the horses, because the horses needed it, and also because the barn was quiet and he wasn't ready to go back to being around people yet. Thomas came in and sat on the stool near the door and was silent for a while, which was entirely normal for Thomas. Then, "I owe you something," Thomas said. "You don't," Silas said. "I do." Not argumentative, just stating. You don't argue with a man about what he owes. Silas let that stand. Thomas looked at the floor, looked up. "I've been watching you since you came onto this ranch," he said. "Watching the way you work, the way you talk to people, the way you—" He stopped, adjusted. "The way you are with my daughter." Silas waited. "I said things to you," Thomas said, "about her, about not wanting to watch her get hurt again." He was choosing words carefully, the way he did when he'd thought about something for a while before saying it. "I meant it. I still mean it. But I think I've been confusing being careful with being—" He stopped, made a small sound. "Afraid." "You lost a wife," Silas said. "You watched your daughter lose a man. You've got reasons to be afraid." "But having reasons doesn't make it right," Thomas said. Silas looked at him. The older man's face was doing that thing again. The thing where too many things were happening behind it and not enough of them were getting out. It was the face of someone who had spent decades being the person who didn't fall apart because if he fell apart, there was nobody else. And it had cost him something, maintaining that, some capacity for whatever it was that came easier to people who'd been allowed to show their cracks. "She laughs more," Thomas said quietly, "since you came." He said it like it was difficult, like laughing more was a fact he'd noted and resisted and finally had to acknowledge. She's been managing this house since she was 22 years old. She manages everything. She always has. But lately, he seemed to be searching for the right word. She looks like she's living in it, not just managing it. Silas didn't say anything. "I'm not giving you anything," Thomas said, and there was a rough edge to it that was the closest he'd come to humor. "I'm not that kind of father, and she doesn't need that kind of handling. She'll decide what she decides, and I'll deal with it." He looked at Silas directly. "But I'm not going to be an obstacle to it anymore. That's all I'm saying." "That means a lot," Silas said, and meant it. Thomas stood, nodded once. "Your shoulder," he said. "I'll live. Wrap it before morning." "I know." Thomas left. Silas stood alone in the barn, listening to the last of the storm move east, the thunder low and distant now, grumbling its way out of the valley. The lantern threw warm light against the stall doors. One of the horses blew softly. The other shifted its weight and settled. He thought about Jesse's face in the water, the arm hooked around the fence post, the calculation in those eyes before he let go. He thought about what it cost to let go of the thing you were holding, how a person had to choose it, actively, against every instinct that said to hold tighter. He thought about Adeline standing in the barn doorway with her hair half down and her hands clasped hard in front of her, saying things she'd measured and decided were true enough to say out loud. He thought about the cedar chest in the house that she'd told him about. The pale blue dress folded inside it, the buttons her mother had sewn with careful hands, the dress that had waited through 8 springs for something its maker had intended. He blew out the lantern. stood in the dark for a moment, in the good smell of hay and horses and clean rain-washed air. Then he went to find some sleep, because the fence line on the south bank was almost certainly down, and tomorrow was going to be a long, hard day, and he intended to be there for all of it. The morning after the flood arrived without apology. The sun came up on a valley that looked like it had been turned inside out. Fence posts canted at wrong angles, debris lines 3 feet up on the barn wall marking where the water had briefly considered coming in and then decided against it. The low pastures still sheeted with standing water that caught the early light and threw it back flat and silver. The Sandoval River had dropped back inside its banks sometime in the night, but it was still running high and fast in the color of old rust, and the sound of it carried all the way to the yard, lower now than the night before, but still with that edge in it, that reminder of what it was capable of when it decided to be something other than scenery. Silas was at the south fence line before 6. His shoulder was wrapped and still angry, and he was running on 4 hours of sleep and coffee that had been made too strong because he'd measured it wrong in the dark. And none of that particularly mattered because the fence was down in 3 places, and the Mercer cattle were currently separated from the Delacroix property by nothing but mutual bovine disinterest, which was not a legal defense anyone wanted to test. Court showed up 20 minutes later with tools and no conversation, which was exactly what the situation required. They worked through the morning in the particular focused silence of 2 men with a clear problem and a shared understanding of how to solve it. By midday, they'd reset 4 posts and restrung 60 yards of wire, and Silas's shoulder had stopped feeling like it was on fire and started feeling like a dull, constant argument he was losing. Jesse appeared at noon with food, biscuits wrapped in cloth, still warm, and a jar of cold coffee, and the slightly diminished energy of someone who'd spent the morning being cared for by his family and found it both appreciated and mildly suffocating. He sat on a fence post and watched them work and said, "Adeline made me stay in until 10. "Smart woman," Court said without looking up. "I'm fine," Jesse said. "I was fine this morning." "You were in a flooded creek last night," Silas said. "I know where I was." "Then you know why she made you stay in until 10, Silas said. Jesse was quiet for a moment, chewing on a biscuit, watching the pasture. Then, "She was up all night. Did you know that? After she came in from after the barn. She sat at the kitchen table until past 2 in the morning. I came down for water and she was just sitting there." Silas kept his hands on the wire. "She had the lamp on," Jesse said. "And she was sewing something. I couldn't see what. She closed it up when she heard me on the stairs." He paused. "She does that sometimes. When she's working through something, she sews." Silas pulled the wire taut and held it while Court stapled. "Jesse," he said. "Yeah. Your sister is a grown woman." "I know she is." "Then let her have her own time." Jesse looked at him, then at Court. Court gave him nothing. Jesse looked back at the pasture. "I'm not interfering," he said. "I'm just saying she was up late, sewing, after she came in from talking to you." He left a pause there that was doing deliberate work. "I thought you should know." Silas straightened and rolled his shoulder carefully, testing the joint. "Eat your biscuit," he said. Jesse smiled to himself and ate his biscuit. It wasn't until the following evening that Silas and Adeline had real time in the same space again, and it arrived the way things did on a working ranch, sideways, incidentally, without the ceremony the moment probably deserved. He was at the water trough in the early dusk, washing the day off his hands, when she came out of the house and crossed the yard toward him, and didn't look like she was on her way somewhere else. She had her shawl, and she had a purposeful set to her jaw that he'd learned to recognize as the expression she wore when she'd made a decision, and was getting on with the execution of it before she could talk herself back. She stopped a few feet from him and said, without preamble, "I want to show you something." He dried his hands. "All right." She led him to the house, which in itself was notable. He'd never been inside past the kitchen doorway, and the kitchen only for the brief logistical exchanges that were the normal traffic of a ranch household. She brought him through the kitchen and down the short hallway to the front room, which was kept tidy in the way rooms were kept tidy when the people in them were too busy to actually use them, everything in its place with the slight stiffness of furniture that didn't get sat in much. At the far wall was a cedar chest. He knew it from her description. He would have known it anyway. It had the look of something that mattered, dark wood worn smooth at the corners by years of hands, a latch that had been polished to a different brightness than the rest of it. She stood in front of it for a moment and didn't open it, just looked at it. "I came down last night," she said, "after we talked. I couldn't sleep, and I came down here and I sat on the floor next to it for a while, which I haven't done since the year my mother died." She said it plainly, not making it into more than it was. "And then I opened it." Silas waited. "I'd put it away after the spring visit," she said. "I always do. Fold it back, close the lid, go back to everything else. Same as every year." She paused. "But this time when I opened it, it looked different, not the dress. The dress is the same, but the way I was looking at it was different." "Different how?" he said. She turned to look at him. Her face was serious and quiet and entirely without performance. "Like it was still possible," she said. "Like the thing it was made for wasn't finished." She pressed her lips together briefly. "I don't know if that makes sense." "It makes sense," he said. She turned back to the chest and opened it. The dress was pale blue in the lamplight, folded with the care of someone who'd handled it many times. He could see, even folded, the delicate work of the bodice, the small covered buttons she'd described. Her mother's hands had made this thing. 8 springs had passed over it. She reached into the chest and brought out something else. A small piece of fabric, pale blue, like the dress but a slightly different shade, and a needle and thread sitting on top of it. The sewing Jessie had seen her doing at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning. "I've been adding to it," she said. "I started last night. I'm adding some stitching here." She indicated the cuff, the hem, a place along the bodice. "My own work, beside hers, so that when it's worn, both of us are in it." He looked at the piece of fabric in her hands, at the careful stitches she'd already begun, at her face. "Adeline," he said. "I'm not asking you anything right now," she said quickly. A little too quickly. "I'm just showing you, because you're the only person I've told about this dress, the real story of it, and I wanted you to see what I'm doing with it." He understood what she was doing. She was building towards something, in the careful, measured way she did everything, laying the foundation stone by stone and making sure each one was level before she set the next. She wasn't going to ask for anything she hadn't made a place for first. He said, "Your mother would have liked that." She looked at the fabric in her hands. Something moved across her face, grief and something else, something warmer and more complex than grief. "I think she would have," she said quietly. "She was practical. She would have been annoyed at me for leaving it in a box for 8 years. Or she'd have understood." "Both," Adeline said. "Both at once." That was her. She almost smiled. She had strong opinions about things being used. She made that dress to be worn at a wedding. She would not have approved of it spending a decade folded in cedar. "Then wear it at a wedding," he said. The words came out before he'd precisely decided to say them. Not impulsive. He didn't do impulsive, hadn't since Caleb, but arrived at faster than he'd planned, like a conclusion that had been building for weeks and finally reached the surface. He didn't take them back. They were true, and he'd said them, and he stood behind them. She looked at him. He met her eyes and stayed where he was. "Silas," she said. Her voice was careful, not frightened. Careful, the way she was careful with things that mattered. "I'm not rushing anything," he said. "I'm not asking you right now. I'm just saying what's true." He paused. "I came here with 43 cents and no intention of staying anywhere, and now I can't find the intention to leave. And the reason I can't find it is standing in front of me with a piece of blue fabric in her hands, and I think she deserves to know that." A long silence. The lamp threw warm light around the room. Outside, the night sounds of the ranch were familiar and settling. The horses, the distant creek, the wind moving through the grass. "I haven't been loved by anyone since Robert," she said, quietly, like she was handing him something breakable. "I don't mean people who care about me. My father, Jesse. I mean, I know what you mean," he said. "And I'm not the same woman I was at 22, she said. "I'm more complicated. I have opinions about fence placement, and I can't abide people who leave things half-finished, and I have spent 8 years being in charge of everything, and I don't hand that off easily." A pause. I'm not easy. I know that, he said. I'm telling you so you understand what you're... Adeline, he said, gentle but direct. I'm a man who's been running from the same 40-acre field in New Mexico for 6 years. I have exactly one friend in the world, and it's your brother, who I've known for 2 months. I have opinions I keep to myself too long, and I don't talk enough about the things that matter, and I'll probably make you furious at least twice before winter. He met her gaze. I'm not easy either. We're even. She looked at him for a long time. The room was very quiet. My father, she said finally. Your father told me he's not going to be an obstacle anymore. His words. Her eyes went slightly wide. He said that? He said it in the barn, after Jesse. She seemed to need a moment to recalibrate around that information. Thomas Mercer saying something like that was, Silas understood, approximately equivalent to a mountain announcing it had reconsidered its position. She stopped. He must have been more frightened than I realized. He loves you, Silas said. He's just not built to say it in a way that's recognizable. She looked at the chest, at the dress, at the piece of fabric in her hands with its careful new stitches. Then she looked at him. I need time, she said. I know. Not because I don't... She stopped, chose. Not because the answer isn't already forming, but because I need to come to it in my own way, in my own time. I need it to be mine, not something that happened to me. Then take the time, he said. I'm not going anywhere. She looked at him with those calm, direct eyes that had first arrested him in the wildflower field, eyes that saw things as they were and didn't flinch from the seeing. And this time what he saw in them was neither grief nor guardedness, but something he hadn't seen there before. Something open. Not all the way. Not yet. But open. Thank you, she said. For Jesse. You thanked me already. I know, I'm saying it again. She held his gaze. And for the other things. The things you don't make a production of. He nodded. She closed the cedar chest carefully, and he went back to the bunkhouse, and the night settled around Silver Mesa the way nights did after storms, cleaner than before, and quieter, and somehow more itself. The next 3 weeks were both ordinary and entirely different from ordinary. The ranch work continued its relentless requirements. The south fence was fully rebuilt, the lower pasture dried out, the cattle were returned to their proper rotation, and the Delacroix fence on the boundary was repaired through an agreement between Thomas and his neighbor that involved 2 days of shared labor and a bottle of something that nobody asked the age of. The summer heat arrived in earnest, and the work shifted its rhythms to match. Starting earlier, breaking during the worst of the afternoon, finishing in the long gold evenings. Silas worked. That was the constant. He worked, and he was there. And he didn't make demands on anything that wasn't yet ready to be demanded of. But something had changed in the household's atmosphere in a way that couldn't be precisely located but was felt by everyone in it. Court felt it, and showed this by being slightly less economical with his words, which meant he was averaging 4 per conversation instead of 2. Danny felt it, and showed it by becoming even more cheerful than usual, which should have been impossible, and yet was happening. Jesse felt it, and showed it by being insufferable in a good-natured way, the particular insufferability of a younger sibling who is absolutely right about something, and is too decent to say so out loud, but also not quite decent enough to let it go entirely unacknowledged. Thomas felt it, and showed it by asking Silas, on a Tuesday morning, what he thought about expanding the south pasture. It was not a question you asked a man you expected to leave. Silas told him his thoughts about the south pasture at some length, and Thomas listened, which was something Thomas Mercer did selectively and deliberately, and at the end of it said, "We'll look at it in the fall," which meant, "You'll be here in the fall," which meant, "I'm counting on it." Adeline showed it by sewing. She was almost always sewing in the evenings now, and she didn't close it up when people came into the room anymore. Silas caught glimpses of it. The pale blue fabric, the new stitching building beside the old in patterns he couldn't quite read from across the room. She never mentioned it directly, but she knew he noticed, and he knew she knew, and that understanding sat between them comfortably, taking up space without demanding anything. They talked more, not only in the evenings on the porch, that had been the routine for weeks, but during the day, briefly, in passing, in the functional language of people who shared a working life. She'd ask his opinion about the water situation in the north pasture and mean it. He'd mention the condition of the barn roof, and she'd make a note of it and actually deal with it. It was the mundane, practical language of two people who were beginning to assume each other's continued presence, and it was the most hopeful kind of communication he'd had in years. There were harder moments, too. He didn't let himself forget that. There was an evening in mid-June when she came to the porch with coffee and sat down and was quiet in a different way than usual. Not the comfortable quiet of two people who didn't need to fill the air, but a withdrawn quiet, a behind-the-wall quiet. He didn't push at it. He just sat and let it be. After about 20 minutes, she said, "Sometimes I think I'm being disloyal to him." He didn't ask who. "I know it's not rational," she said. "He's been gone 8 years and Robert was not a man who would have wanted me to be alone for 8 years. She paused. "He was the most generous person I ever knew. He would have wanted something better than this for me." "Then it's not disloyal," Silas said. "I know." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I know it in my head. The rest of me is slower." "Take all the time the rest of you needs," he said. She looked at him. "You're very patient." "I'm practicing," he said honestly. "It doesn't come natural." She almost laughed. He counted that as a victory of modest but real proportions. There was also the afternoon that Thomas caught him alone at the water trough and said, without looking at him, "I need to tell you something I should have said earlier." Silas waited. Thomas was quiet long enough that it was clearly costing him something. "I was afraid of you," Thomas said finally. "When you came, not of you personally, of what you represented, another man my daughter might care about, another reason for the river to matter." He paused. "I was unkind in the way I spoke to you, about her, like she was something that needed protecting from herself." "You were protecting her," Silas said. "I was protecting myself," Thomas said, rough. "There's a difference, and I knew it, and I did it anyway." He looked at Silas directly. "She's 30 years old. She's been running this household since she was 22. She doesn't need a father making decisions about what she can survive." Silas thought about what to say and settled on, "You said she laughs more." Thomas looked at him. "That's not nothing," Silas said. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then something in his face shifted, not softened exactly, because Thomas Mercer's face didn't do soft easily, but settled, like something had been set down. "No," Thomas said. "It's not nothing." He walked away, and Silas understood that was the closest Thomas Mercer was going to come to a blessing, and it was enough. The moment Silas had stopped expecting came on a Saturday morning in the last week of June. He was in the garden, a patch of ground near the bunkhouse that he'd started working on 6 weeks ago, tentatively, uncertain if the gesture would be read correctly, turning the soil and putting in seeds he'd bought from the store in Caldwell without mentioning them to anyone. He'd been out here in the early mornings and sometimes in the evenings, and things had started coming up, tomatoes mostly, and some beans and a row of something he was fairly sure was going to be squash despite the seed packet's suggestion that it was carrots. He heard her footsteps behind him on the path. He knew her walk by now, the particular rhythm of it, the slight quickness that was characteristic of someone who walked with purpose, even when they had nowhere urgent to be. He didn't turn around immediately. He finished tamping down the soil around a tomato plant, then stood and turned. She was standing on the path with her hands at her sides, and her chin level, and her expression carrying the look he'd learned to recognize as her decision face, the one that appeared when she'd finished deliberating and was done. "I finished it," she said. He waited. "The stitching," she said, "on the dress." "I finished it this morning." She paused. "I put my last stitch in beside my mother's first one, so the whole thing goes around." Her voice was steady, not effortlessly steady. He could hear what it cost to keep it that way, but steady by choice. "And when I finished, I closed the chest, and I thought, I don't want to put this dress away again." He stood with dirt on his hands and looked at her. "I thought about what you said," she said, "about wearing it at a wedding." She met his eyes. "I thought about whether the man standing next to me in my head when I thought about it was Robert." A beat. It wasn't, she said. He held very still. It's been 8 years, she said, and I've been afraid for most of them. Afraid that loving someone again would mean losing them again. And I understand now that the fear is real, and it's always going to be real, because that is simply true about loving people, that you can lose them. But I've been treating the fear like it was a reason to stop, and it isn't. She took a breath. It's just the cost of living the right way. He crossed the distance between them. Not fast, not with any particular drama, just with the directness of a man who'd made up his mind and knew where he was going. He stopped in front of her, and he was aware of his dirty hands and his rough clothes, and the fact that he was not, had never been, and would never be the kind of man who did this with any particular grace. He said, I would like to be the man next to you in that image. She looked up at him. Her eyes were bright, but not overflowing. That was Adeline. She felt things fully and showed them precisely, never more than what was actually there. I know you would, she said. That's why I'm here. He reached out and took her hand. The direct, simple contact of it, her hand in his, both of them standing in the morning sun next to a vegetable garden that was listing slightly to the south, felt like the most significant thing he'd done since he'd ridden through the Mercer gate 43 cents and 6 years of running ago. Ask me, she said. Quiet, direct. Adeline Mercer, he said, will you let me stand beside you? Not quite a question, almost a statement, the way truth sometimes came out. She squeezed his hand. Yes, she said. Behind them, from the direction of the main house porch, came the sound of something being knocked over and then Jesse's voice saying something they couldn't make out, and then Court's rare, dry response, and Danny's laugh. The ordinary noise of a household rolling out into a summer morning like it had no idea what had just happened 10 yards away. Thomas appeared in the kitchen doorway and looked across the yard at them. He didn't say anything. He looked at his daughter and at the man holding her hand, and something in his face did the thing it almost never did. Opened up, just for a second, just long enough for the grief and the relief and the long, complicated love of a father for his child to be visible before the door swung back into its usual position. He raised his coffee cup in their direction, the smallest possible gesture. Adeline saw it. She raised a hand back, and Thomas Mercer turned and went inside and gave them the morning. Silas stood in his garden in the June sun, holding the hand of a woman who'd worn her grief honestly and come through it to something better. And he thought about roots, about what they were and what they required and what they made possible. He had planted a garden. He had planted it without knowing if he was staying, and then he'd stayed. And now the tomatoes were coming in and the beans were reaching, and even the alleged carrots were doing something interesting in the soil. And all of it had started with just turning the dirt and putting the seeds down and deciding that whatever came next, he was going to be there for it. He looked at the Mercer ranch spreading out around them, the barns, the fences, the pastures with their cattle, the whole working, breathing life of the place. And he looked at Adeline beside him, and he thought, this is what it feels like to stop running. He wasn't sure it was comfortable. Probably it wasn't going to be comfortable very often. It was going to be a fence that needed fixing and a river that rose without warning and a father who expressed love through coffee cup gestures and a brother who told you everything you weren't supposed to know with the cheerful certainty that it was for your own good, and it was going to be hard work every single day and an aching shoulder and 43 cents in your pocket, becoming something else over time, slowly, by accumulation. But he was going to be here for it, all of it. Adeline turned to look at him, and the morning was very bright, and the garden was growing, and the river ran on in the distance, changed but present, the way rivers were, the way everything was that you'd survived together. They didn't tell anyone right away. Not because they were hiding it. Adeline Mercer was not a woman who hid things, and Silas had spent enough of his life being indirect about what mattered to have developed a genuine distaste for it. But because there was a particular quality to the first few days after a decision like that, a quietness that belonged only to the two people who'd made it, and both of them recognized it without discussing it and moved through the last days of June protecting that space. Jesse figured it out by the second morning. He said nothing, which was the most restrained thing Silas had ever seen him do, But the grin he was suppressing at breakfast on Sunday was doing significant structural damage to his face, and Silas respected the effort without commenting on it. Court figured it out sometime that week and marked the occasion by saying, at the water trough on Wednesday, "Good," and walking away. Which from Court was essentially a speech. Danny figured it out last, which was appropriate, and when he did, he became so visibly delighted that Adeline had to tell him firmly that if he said a word before she and Silas had spoken to her father, she would find something deeply unpleasant for him to do for the rest of the summer. Danny agreed immediately and then spent the next 2 days radiating contained joy like a lamp with a cloth over it. The conversation with Thomas happened on a Thursday evening, after supper, after the dishes were cleared and Jesse had made himself diplomatically scarce with the transparent excuse of needing to review some legal correspondence in the barn, which fooled no one. Adeline and Silas sat across from Thomas at the kitchen table. Thomas had his coffee and his usual expression, that measured twice before deciding look, and he moved his eyes between them once and then settled them on his coffee cup and said, "All right, say what you came to say." Adeline said, "Silas has asked me to marry him." Thomas was quiet. "And I said yes," she said. More quiet. The lamp on the table put warm light on Thomas's face, and Silas watched the man do his internal work. The same work he always did, processing through the layers, getting down to what was actually true underneath the reflex and the history and the fear. "You're certain," Thomas said, to Adeline, not to Silas. "I don't say things I'm not certain about," she said. "You know that." "I know that." Thomas picked up his coffee cup, set it back down without drinking. Then he looked at Silas directly, with the full weight of those measuring eyes. "You'll stay," he said. Not a question, a condition stated out loud. "I'll stay," Silas said. "This is where I'm building. And if something pulls you—" "Thomas," Adeline said, quiet but firm. "I need to say it," Thomas said. Not defensive, just honest. "Then say it," Silas said. "I'd rather you say it to my face than carry it around." Thomas looked at him for a long moment. "I've watched my daughter grieve for 8 years," he said. "I watched her mother grieve herself sick. I cannot watch that again. I cannot watch her choose someone and lose him and have to rebuild from nothing a second time. I am too old for it, and she is too good for it." He paused. "So I need you to understand what you are taking on, what staying means in this family. It doesn't mean being here when it's easy." "I know that," Silas said. "The river is always there," Thomas said. "This valley floods. The work is hard and it breaks men physically and financially. And I've seen strong men leave when the difficulty hit a certain pitch. I need to know you're not one of those men." Silas thought about 6 years of moving, about how he'd been the kind of man who left when things got heavy because the leaving had felt like freedom and only later revealed itself as something different. He could have said that, could have explained it all. Caleb, the cigarette, the 50 yards, the way guilt had been masquerading as practicality for years. But Thomas Mercer didn't need the full accounting. He needed the truth of where Silas was now. "I planted a garden," Silas said. Thomas blinked. It was not the answer he'd been expecting. "In the yard by the bunkhouse," Silas said, 6 weeks ago. Tomatoes and beans and some things that claim to be carrots, but I have doubts. I planted them when I didn't know for certain I was staying, and I stayed anyway, and they're coming in." He paused. "A man who's planning to leave doesn't put seeds in the ground. You know that as well as I do." Thomas looked at him. The quiet stretched out, but it was a working quiet, not a hostile one. "The carrots," Thomas said finally. "Sir? You need to thin them," Thomas said. "If you leave them crowded, they won't develop right." He picked up his coffee cup and this time drank from it. "I'll show you in the morning." Adeline looked at her father. Something moved across her face that was too layered to be called a single thing. Love and relief and the particular tenderness of a daughter who had spent years watching her father carry grief and fear and was watching him, incrementally, put some of it down. "Pa," she said softly. Thomas looked at his daughter, and his face did the thing it had done across the yard on the morning after the flood. Opened briefly, showed what was behind the door, then settled back. But this time it stayed open a little longer, long enough for something real to pass between them. "Your mother would have liked him," Thomas said. His voice was rough at the edges. "She would have told me so about 47 times until I agreed with her, just so you know." Adeline pressed her lips together. Her eyes were bright. "I know," she said. "I've thought about that." "Good." Thomas stood. He put his hand on the table, briefly, near Adeline's hand but not quite on it. The gesture of a man who showed affection through proximity rather than contact, who'd done it that way for so long he probably no longer noticed. Then he looked at Silas. "My wife's name was Clara," he said. "She made that dress. She would have wanted it worn properly. Don't wait too long." He took his coffee and went to his room, and that was Thomas Mercer's version of a celebration. They were married in the second week of April, not the frontier chapel Adeline had imagined as a young woman. That building had partially collapsed in a winter storm 3 years back, and the community was still in the slow, collective process of deciding what to do about it. Instead, they were married in the yard of the Mercer Ranch, on a morning that couldn't decide if it was cool or warm and kept shifting between the two. The sky a clear and guileless blue, and the wind from the south carrying the smell of the pasture and the distant hint of the river, present and ordinary, and no longer a villain in the story. The dress was exactly what it had always been, pale blue, fitted, with the small covered buttons her mother had sewn with patient hands. But along the cuffs and the hem, and up one side of the bodice, Adeline's own stitching ran beside Clara's original work, 2 sets of hands in the same fabric, the same care expressed in different years by different women who had loved the same family. You had to look closely to see where one ended and the other began. Adeline had done that on purpose. Silas stood in the yard in a clean shirt and his better jacket and watched her come out of the house and felt something happen in his chest that he didn't have precise language for. He'd stood in a lot of places in 6 years of moving, and he'd been present for a lot of things, and he'd convinced himself for a long time that presence was what he had to offer, because commitment was something he'd forfeited the right to at the edge of that field in New Mexico. Watching her cross the yard toward him, he understood that he'd been wrong about that for a long time, and it had taken a wildflower field, and a calf, and a raging river, and 43 cents and 2 months of coffee on a porch to correct the error. He was not a man who cried. He would not have described what happened to him as crying. But his eyes did something, briefly, that he was glad nobody commented on, because Jesse absolutely noticed and absolutely would have said something if the situation had been even slightly less sacred. The ceremony was short and plain and entirely theirs. Reverend Callis from Caldwell performed it, a dry, practical man who understood that some people wanted the ceremony and some wanted the marriage and wisely gave them both in under 15 minutes. Thomas stood to Adeline's left with his hands clasped behind his back and his jaw working slightly in the way it did when he was managing himself. And Jesse stood on Silas's side because Silas had asked him to, and Jesse had agreed with characteristic straightforward ease, as if the question were obvious, which he'd probably considered it. Court and Danny stood at the back. Danny cried openly and without apparent embarrassment. Court stood with his arms folded and his expression unchanging, which was Court's version of being moved. 3 families from neighboring properties had come. The Delacroix family, whose fence they'd repaired after the flood, and 2 others whose names Silas was still learning. They stood in a loose group and witnessed without crowding, and afterward offered handshakes and a jar of preserved fruit from Mrs. Delacroix that was accepted with genuine gratitude. When it was done, when Reverend Callis had said the final words and Silas had kissed his wife for the first time with the whole yard watching, Adeline stood beside him and looked out at the people gathered and the ranch behind them and the spring morning surrounding all of it, and she said quietly, just to him, she would have been happy today. He knew she meant her mother. He put his hand over hers where it rested on his arm. Yes, he said, she would. And Robert, she said. And her voice was steady when she said it, and the word had weight, but not the crushing kind, the kind that lived in the past rather than pressing on the present. He would have been glad for me. I know that now. He looked at her. You're sure? I've had 8 years to think about who he was, she said simply. He would have been glad. She paused. It took me a long time to let that be true instead of just knowing it. Silas understood the distinction. Knowing something and letting it be true were not the same action and did not happen on the same schedule, and anyone who told you otherwise had not yet been tested on the subject. Jesse appeared at his elbow with a plate of food and a cheerful lack of awareness of whether he was interrupting anything, and the moment dissolved into the ordinary, wonderful noise of a family gathering, which was as it should be. The first months of their marriage were not a fairy tale. Silas had not expected them to be, and Adeline had not wanted them to be, because a fairy tale was a story about exceptional people in exceptional circumstances, and what they'd both worked toward was something more durable than that, an ordinary life, conducted honestly. It was hard in the ways that lives were hard. The summer was dry, and the cattle required more management than a wet year would have demanded, and Silas's shoulder, the one he'd hurt in the river, developed a habit of stiffening in the early mornings that he managed with liniment and stubbornness, and by not mentioning it until Adeline noticed and told him flatly that suffering silently when there were solutions available was a form of pride she didn't have patience for. He started mentioning it. They adjusted the morning work accordingly. She was, as advertised, not easy. She had opinions about the organization of every physical space on the ranch, and was usually right about them, which made arguing with her both reasonable and futile. She kept the accounts with a precision that occasionally revealed places where Silas had underestimated the cost of things, and she told him about these places directly and without softening, because softening was, in her view, what you did when you didn't respect someone enough to give them accurate information. He appreciated this even when it stung. Especially when it stung, actually. He was not easy either. He went quiet when things were difficult, in the way he'd always gone quiet, turning inward, working through things alone before he was ready to bring them out. And she had to learn the difference between his working through quiet and his avoiding quiet, which took about 4 months and several pointed conversations before they'd calibrated it. He had to learn that she interpreted silence as distance unless he told her explicitly that it wasn't, and telling her explicitly was something he had to practice, because it didn't come naturally to a man who'd spent 6 years talking primarily to horses. They had their first real argument in August, about money, specifically about whether to take a loan from a bank in Caldwell to expand the cattle operation in the way Thomas had been considering and Silas had been advocating for. Adeline was against it with a conviction that traced back to watching her father navigate 2 bad years in the mid-'80s when the cattle prices had collapsed and the loan payments had not, and Silas understood her position and still thought she was wrong, and they went around it twice in one evening before she said, "I need you to hear what I'm actually afraid of." And he said, "Tell me." And she told him, and it turned out what she was afraid of was not primarily financial. What she was afraid of was the ranch failing, not because of money, but because of what the ranch represented, the thing her father had built and maintained through losses that would have broken other men, the ground her mother was buried in, the place she'd stayed when she could have left and rebuilt her life somewhere else, the home she'd chosen every single day for 8 years, when choosing it meant choosing also the grief that lived there. "If we overextend and it fails," she said, "it's not just a business decision, it's everything we've stayed for." He sat with that for a while. Then he said, "We won't overextend, but not growing isn't safe either. A ranch that doesn't grow when it can is just a ranch that's shrinking slowly." She was quiet. "Tell me the number you'd be comfortable with," he said. "The loan amount that lets us expand without keeping you up at night. We'll work with that number." She looked at him. "You'd do that." "Of course I'd do that. It's your home. It's your family's ground. Your comfort with the risk matters." She named a number. It was lower than what he'd been thinking. They borrowed it, expanded carefully, and by the following spring the decision had paid back in a way that wasn't dramatic but was solid, the way good decisions usually paid. Not with sudden wealth, but with a margin that hadn't existed before, a little more room to breathe. He didn't say, "I told you so." She didn't say, "You were right." They both knew both things and left them unsaid, which was its own kind of communication. Thomas watched all of this from his position as a man who was nominally retired from decision-making and actually incapable of entirely relinquishing it. He and Silas developed an ongoing negotiation about this that was never directly discussed and rarely caused friction, because Silas was careful to involve Thomas in decisions in a way that gave him genuine input rather than the performance of input, and Thomas was, slowly, incrementally, in the way Thomas did everything, learning that his daughter's husband was not a man who needed managing. There was an evening in late September, a year into the marriage, when Silas found Thomas at the edge of the garden that had grown considerably since its modest beginning, expanded to include winter vegetables and a row of herbs that Adeline had requested, and Silas had planted with more care than he'd ever given anything of that kind in his life. Thomas was looking at it with his hands in his pockets and the expression he wore when he was thinking something he hadn't said yet. Clara grew herbs, Thomas said, along the south wall of the house. She was particular about them. Silas came to stand beside him. What kind? Rosemary, mostly. Some sage. She said they kept the flies down. I don't know if that was true or if she just liked the smell. He paused. She would have argued with you about where you put the tomatoes. I put them in the wrong spot, Silas said. Too much afternoon shade from the barn. She'd have pointed it out inside the first week. Thomas almost smiled. It was the most complete version of that expression Silas had seen from him. She was always right about the garden. I'll move them in the spring, Silas said. Thomas nodded. Was quiet for a moment. She would have liked you, he said. I told Adeline that, on their wedding day. But I want to tell you directly. He looked at Silas. She would have liked that you don't require things to be simple. Clara was never simple either. She thought people who required simplicity from others were just people who wanted permission to be lazy. Silas said, She sounds like Adeline. Adeline is more patient, Thomas said. Clara was... He stopped, adjusted. She would correct you before you'd finished being wrong. She didn't see the point in waiting. He made a sound that was almost a laugh. You would have been corrected often. I'm used to it, Silas said. Adeline comes by it honestly, apparently. Thomas did laugh then. Briefly, genuine, the laugh of a man who hadn't expected to and was mildly surprised by his own capacity for it. He looked at the garden for another moment. Then he said, I'm glad you planted this, and walked back toward the house. Silas stood in the garden in the September evening and thought about roots again, about how he'd planted this particular garden in uncertainty and stayed anyway, and the garden had grown. And then he'd planted himself in this family in uncertainty and stayed anyway. And something had grown there too, in the particular stubborn way that things grew when you gave them time and showed up every day regardless of the weather. He thought about Caleb. He did this less often now, not because he'd forgotten, not because the loss had diminished, but because he'd finally allowed it to take up the right amount of space, the space it actually occupied rather than the space he'd been assigning it as a way of managing his guilt. Caleb would have had opinions about Silver Mesa. He would have liked Jesse immediately and been slightly suspicious of Court, and found Thomas deeply entertaining in a way he'd have been careful not to show. He would have approved of Adeline in the specific, wholehearted way Caleb approved of people who didn't pretend to be less than they were. He would have told Silas to stop running about 4 years earlier than Silas had managed it on his own. He would have been right. He usually had been. The following spring arrived the way Silver Mesa springs arrived. Not gently, not with ceremony, but all at once. The wildflowers coming up in the pastures, and the river running high but controlled, and the air changing overnight from the cold weight of winter to something that carried possibility in it, whether you were looking for it or not. Adeline went to the north field on the April morning she always went. Silas knew. He didn't follow. He hadn't followed since that first time with the wayward calf, and he wasn't going to follow now, because the visit was hers, and it belonged to her, and the fact that she still went was not something he felt any need to manage or understand beyond what she'd already told him. She came back an hour later and found him at the south fence, which always needed something, checking the wire he'd replaced in the fall. She came up beside him and leaned on the fence post and didn't say anything for a minute, just looked at the pasture. Then she said, "It's different this year." He waited. "I went to the same spot," she said. "Same field, same flowers coming up, and I thought about Robert, and I thought about my mother, and I felt the loss of them, which I think I'll always feel, and that's right." She paused. "But I didn't feel lonely. That's what was different. I've gone out there every spring for 9 years, and every year the grief has been there, and underneath the grief there's been this loneliness, this specific loneliness that I didn't know how to describe but always felt. She looked at him. It wasn't there this year. He looked at her. I think I've been grieving them and grieving myself at the same time, she said. The self I was going to be. The life that was going to happen. And I didn't notice I was doing both until this year, when the one kind of grief was still there, and the other kind was gone. He said, Does it feel like something's missing? That it's gone? She thought about it. No, she said. It feels like I put something down. A pause. Like I finally put it down. He reached out and took her hand on the fence rail. She turned hers over and held his. The dress, he said. What are you going to do with it? Keep it, she said immediately. Of course keep it. It was made with her hands. It has both our work in it now. It goes to whoever comes next. She glanced at him sideways, assuming someone comes next. He looked at her. She was looking at the pasture with a deliberately neutral expression that was doing several things at once, the way her expressions usually did. Are you telling me something? He said. She turned to look at him directly, and her face did the thing it rarely did in front of other people. Opened up completely, showed exactly what was there, no management, no measuring, just the full direct look of a woman who had learned the hard way that honesty was more durable than protection. It's early, she said. I'm not certain yet, but possibly. He stood very still. He was aware of the fence post under his hand and the spring air and the sound of the pasture and his own heartbeat doing something uncharacteristic. Possibly, he said. I wanted to tell you before I was certain, she said, because I thought you'd want to know the moment I did, and I wanted to not be afraid while I told you, and I'm not afraid, so now seemed right. He turned to face her fully. She was watching him with that steady, clear gaze, the one that had first caught him in this same north field a year ago, the one that saw things as they actually were and decided that was all right. Not afraid, he said. Not afraid, she confirmed. Nervous. Hopeful. Not afraid. He brought her hand up and pressed it briefly to his mouth, the back of her knuckles, the kind of gesture that didn't have a name but didn't need one. She leaned her head against his shoulder for a moment. Briefly, practical Adeline, not given to prolonged softness when there was a ranch to run, and then straightened. The south fence needs work, she said. I know, he said. I'm looking at it. The third post from the left has been leaning since March. I see that. I'm going to make sure Jessie hasn't gotten into the lunch provisions early, she said. Come in when you're done. I will, he said. She walked back toward the house. He watched her go. The particular rhythm of her walk, the set of her shoulders, the way she moved through the yard of this ranch like a woman who'd earned every inch of it, which she had, many times over. He turned back to the fence. The third post from the left was indeed leaning. He'd need to reset it properly, pull it, retamp the ground, reset the wire. An hour's work, maybe more with the soil as dry as it was. He'd need to bring water from the trough. He got to work. The spring morning moved around him, the light getting stronger, the pasture coming alive with the sounds of cattle and birds, and the distant creek running high and easy. Nothing like a threat, just water moving through land that had learned to hold it. The wildflowers were coming up in the north field. The tomatoes would go in the ground next week, in a better spot this year, the spot Thomas had shown him where they'd get the right light. The garden would grow. The ranch would grow. Something else possibly was growing too, early and uncertain and surrounded by hope rather than fear for the first time in a long time. He reset the post. He restrung the wire. He moved down the fence line to the next thing that needed attention, and then the next, the way you always moved on a working ranch. From the thing that needed doing to the thing that needed doing, with no promise that you'd finish everything but a commitment to keep showing up until you did. He had 43 cents when he rode through this gate. He had dirt on his hands and a healed shoulder and a name that meant something in this county now, and a wife inside that house, and a father-in-law who was going to show him the correct placement for tomatoes in the spring. He had a brother he'd loved and lost, and finally learned to carry without it crushing him. He had a garden that had started as a question and become an answer. He had roots. He had not gone looking for any of it. He'd just stopped running long enough for it to find him, And then, this was the part that mattered, the part he'd tell anyone who asked, he'd stayed. That was the whole of it, really. That was the whole story. You stayed. You showed up for the fence and the flood and the hard conversations and the mornings after bad nights and the question of where to put the tomatoes. You didn't wait until you were certain it would work out. You couldn't wait for that because that certainty didn't exist for anyone. You just decided that the people in front of you were worth the risk of being wrong, and then you stayed and you kept staying, and eventually staying became the only thing you knew how to do. The fence ran straight and taut along the south boundary of the Mercer Ranch. Silas walked its length one more time, testing each post, checking the wire, doing the work. Above him, the spring sky was wide and blue and entirely indifferent to human drama in the way that big skies were. And somewhere in the north field, the wildflowers were coming up again. The same flowers that had come up every April for as long as anyone on the ranch could remember. Indifferent also, just growing, just doing the only thing they knew how to do when the season turned and the ground warmed and the conditions were finally right, which was bloom.